Hey everyone, and welcome to another video. So today we're taking a look at the Eufy E340. So this is their new floodlight camera. This is a dual camera setup, so you do have a ultra wide as well as a telephoto lens contained within the actual camera unit. First thing we'll do is we'll just take a look at the actual packaging. So as with all Eufy products, it comes packaged really well. This is similar to Anker products as well, because Anker do own Eufy. So you will see a sort of similarity between the way that they're packaged. Everything is nice and enclosed. You do have the actual camera unit itself, and then you have the instructions and all of the installation tools that you'll need in that side little package that comes with it. Taking a look at the actual camera itself, you'll see that on the bottom you do have access to the SD card slot as well as where the sync button is. A couple of things to note for when you're actually doing your setup is with any of these sort of battery powered cameras, especially ones that are link up to any home bases that you might have or that come with the unit, you always want to do the setup inside regardless of whether they're a wired or battery powered unit. Reason for this is you want to make sure everything's set up and connected to the home base before you actually go out and set it up, where your signal strength might mean that it struggles to do that initial installation. You also want to make sure that you do any software updates or firmware updates for any of the devices to make sure that everything's working as it should. A lot of these newer products that do come out, originally when you first connect them, they may have a few bugs, which I will go into a little later on. That's why you want to try and do your best to set everything up inside prior to actually doing the full manual installation. Okay, so with this particular one, you can have it as a standalone. It will work on its own, and obviously you have that option for the SD card, but you can also link it up to the Homebase 3. That's the way that I've got mine set up. But what I would recommend, and what I found was, because of when I was actually installing this and testing it, it wouldn't link directly to the home base. So every time I did that, it was just looping within the app. So what I did was I set up the camera as a standalone, and then I linked it to the home base. Now this does come with one sort of caveat, depending on what firmware you have on your Homebase 3. Originally, when I first did this, it wasn't recording in 3K, which is what this camera should be capable of. Any of your motion recorded events were only recording in the equivalent of sort of 1080p, so the quality was much lower. Any manually recorded events were still recording in 3K, which was where I kind of got confused as part of this review, hence why this review was delayed a little, because I wanted to actually go back and recheck all of the clips that I actually recorded, because a lot of them initially were actually recording in the equivalent of 1080p, whereas I was thinking that they were recording or outputting in 3K. As far as the installation goes, the actual physical installation is quite simple if you've done any type of electrical work. If you haven't done, or if you're not comfortable with electrical work, then obviously always seek a professional to actually do the installation. The installation itself is quite simple. Where I installed mine, I had an existing porch light. So this is replacing just a standard porch light that I actually had. The reason I chose this particular location is because I had a battery powered camera, another one from Eufy. It was one of my original cameras, and that actually, despite being connected to a solar panel, would keep going dead. And as I've found out later, it's actually because the battery inside it is defective or something. So I was kind of tired of constantly charging that, so I thought this is a good option where I can just wire this in. It gives me more coverage because this is 360 degrees coverage, and it also gives you that floodlight option as well. So it gives you the option of a night light, which I could do with my previous setup, but it was more complicated, whereas this makes it a lot more simpler and the whole thing is a lot more streamlined. So as far as the installation goes, my previous light that was there, it had the old style of just red and black wires, whereas these, if you look at any of the wiring diagrams, they'll have the blue, the brown, and then the yellow and green for your earth. Once again, as I say, it's quite simple if you've done any type of electrical work. If you haven't, then always seek a professional. It does come with all of the instructions within the app, so it will literally guide you step by step in terms of how to do it. And having done this with the previous generation of floodlight camera that I installed in my back garden, this was quite a straightforward procedure. So I kind of knew what to expect, and the installation was more or less the same. The one big difference that this one has is it has a little cutout, a little tab that you can break, and that allows you to actually take the cables, if you're ceiling mounting this, out of the front of the camera rather than having them come out of the base and then obviously trapping the cable. Now the one downside of that is that the cables are exposed at the front of the camera, because that's where the sensors are, so that's the orientation that you're going to want to actually hang the camera in. For me, I think this should have either been on the side or at the back, or they should have given us an option of having maybe 3 locations where you could have had this at the back and each side. Coming out the front, it doesn't really look that good. So personally, I think that's one sort of downside of this particular setup. Aside from that, my setup is still temporary because I may still swap the floodlight camera that I've installed in my porch area with the one that I've got in my garden. I'll wait and see. Everything is working and it was hooked up relatively simply. The longest part of this whole installation was trying to figure out what was actually going on with my existing wires, as opposed to anything to do with the actual floodlight camera itself. Okay, so once I had it installed, I did do quite a few tests. So initially when I installed it, it was during the day. We are in winter and our days are not very long. So I did as many sort of day samples as I could get in terms of the sort of keying motion track and everything like that. I did a few tests of those. I then tested some just after sunset and also some just, once it was fully dark. All of them do quite well. And the image that you actually get out of the camera is much better than obviously what I had there previously, which was a 1080p setup. The one sort of downside that I found in this location, and is probably more to do with my setup and my sort of location where I've got installed, is because of the white sort of render that I've got on my walls. It means that the night vision is kind of pointless because if anything, it actually reduces the visibility that you get from the camera. So the best setup would be just having color night vision, but a lot of times that won't kick in until it has a certain level of light. So what I found was either having that completely off or leaving the actual floodlight on just a tiny bit to light up the area enough to where it actually can see something is a way to get around that. Ultimately, the night vision does help out in certain scenarios, the black and white night vision, but the colored night vision or just having night vision completely disabled are the best options for me, because once the floodlights do kick in, it does light everything up bright enough to where you can actually see everything quite clearly anyway. In terms of tracking, the one sort of downside I have is obviously because of the location I've installed this in, it is overlooking the neighbour's front door as well. So it's on the side, but it's basically their front door. The one downside I've found that I'm hoping that they can actually fix through the app at some point is you do have the option of privacy zones, so you can block off certain zones. However, when I go into that in the app, it doesn't allow you to do that whilst also maintaining or making use of motion tracking or any of the AI features. So essentially, if the camera moves, then it won't allow you to use privacy zones. I'm hoping that this is something that they can actually change and add in the future, so then you can actually have privacy zones for any areas that are overlooked, whilst also maintaining the usage of motion tracking as well as AI detection that's part of the Homebase 3. Okay, so coming on to some of the positives that I found with the camera. Firstly, obviously the video quality being in 3K and obviously having those two lenses does mean that you can capture more or less everything that you need to. My setup, as I mentioned before, is not ideal for best use case for this particular camera because the telephoto lens in particular is kind of focused in on the center sort of section of the actual camera or the viewpoint of the ultra wide. So a lot of times with my setup, whatever's in shot is towards either the lower ends or the top ends of the frame. So the telephoto isn't necessarily focusing in on that subject all the time. However, the main reason I put this in this location was in order to capture people's faces as they were walking down the pathway towards my front door. So that's something that the previous cameras, any of the motion detection, they'd always fail because they weren't 24/7. So by the time they actually detected somebody and started recording, a lot of times you wouldn't actually capture their faces. And even on the other three sort of cameras that had set up around there and in and around that area, the only one that would actually capture it would be the doorbell, and that was limited to 120 seconds. This one being linked to the Homebase means that it's recording 24/7 and it records the events as well. So at the moment, what I saw from the app, you couldn't go in and just download entire sections, but you could view it back. And obviously if you needed to, you could do some sort of screen recording or something like that. Any events are fully recorded, so you can actually go back and it'll search through those and you can flick through those quite easily. So it means that you're not having to search through hours and hours of footage. The AI detection, as far as I could see, also works quite well on the Homebase 3 as well. So it will detect certain things, and I've disabled the pet detection and it's completely cut out any of the cats that do tend to walk along the fences that we have there almost on a daily basis. Another positive that I found is initially when I installed the previous generation of floodlight camera, I did have a lot of problems with it where it would just randomly go out, in particular whenever the weather got cold. Rain and stuff like that never really affected it, but the cold weather always seemed to trip it out and it would just stop responding. And the only way to get it back would be to basically power cycle it. So kill the power and then reboot it up again. And then it would just reconnect everything and work perfectly fine again. I've not had a single issue like that with this particular camera. Another issue that it did resolve compared to the previous generation is by not having the lens over the actual camera section, it means that you're not getting that glare that you used to get on the previous generation. So on the previous one, depending on the angle of the sun, a lot of times your image will become incredibly washed out, maybe early morning or towards sunset where you've got a really low sun, and it would almost blind the camera in certain scenarios. Also, the flashlight would actually bounce off the lens and it would actually cause glare on the image. Because this one doesn't have any covers over the actual camera section, it means that the image that comes out of it is a lot clearer. So that's one issue that's been resolved. Hopefully this will also resolve any potential issues where you've got condensation buildup within any of those enclosed sections, because that's something that has failed on previous generation of cameras that have seen the similar style to this. Finally, coming on to the actual nightlight, the floodlight part of this, and you can set the floodlight on a timer, and you can have it set to come on at sunset, go off at sunrise, depending on your location, and you can choose anywhere from like 1 up to 100%, I'm guessing, of the actual power. I think I had mine set to about 5, and that was enough just to illuminate the section. And then once it actually detects motion, it'll actually kick in. And once again, you can choose what brightness you have the full floodlight to come on as well. With mine, I just chose 100%, and as you'll see from the clips, it's bright enough to where it lights up all of that section and it actually shines out onto the driveway. It's that bright, so it's perfect for that location for me. Okay, so coming on to some of the negative points, and firstly, as I've mentioned already, initially when you set this up, the Homebase 3 is not gonna work correctly. So initially it's actually recording to 1080p. Now I have been told that that is a firmware fix, so once you update your Homebase 3 to firmware 3.4.2.1, that will actually resolve this issue. I know Lifehackster did actually post a video where he sort of created a workaround. You go in and you change the settings to 1080p and then you change it back to 3K, but realistically you shouldn't need to do that every single time. And the other issue that I was actually having with mine was the hack, or the workaround, was that you just go in and manually change it from 3K to 1080p. That tells the Homebase that it's set to 1080p. When you then put it back to 3K, it will then actually give it full resolution. Now this initially worked for me, but the next day I actually checked the recordings and they were back down to 1080p again. The other thing I have noticed is whenever you're watching the live feed and there's motion detected, the image deteriorates quite drastically. So it actually drops down to, I'm sure, well below 1080p. And if anything, just at the point when you're actually detecting movement, it actually becomes quite blurry. So it's almost pointless at that point. But all of these issues, I'm sure, can be resolved. And I've been told with my communication with Eufy is that they have already been looked at, and any a firmware update that is coming will resolve these issues for you. Another issue that I've mentioned previously in security camera reviews, and that is the frame rate. So pretty much all of the Eufy cameras that I have all record at 15 FPS or frames per second. That for me is not fast enough for a security camera. I appreciate the extra resolution that we've been getting from the Eufy cameras of late, both 2K, 3K and 4K cameras. However, if you still have a 15 FPS frame rate, then what that means is if a subject is moving too quickly, you will still not be able to capture their face clearly. And you'll see this from the actual small thumbnails that it creates of subjects whenever it's captured face. The best way to get around this is to have a minimum of 30 FPS in my opinion, and ideally 60 or higher would actually be the best way for a security camera to actually correctly identify people. The faster the frame rate, the smoother the video, and the easier it is for the AI to pick out individual frames in order to capture a face. Because once a subject is moving towards or away from a camera, you're not going to have that focus in place in the same way that you would if the frame rate was double, triple what it currently is. I'm not sure if that's something that they can actually do. I have asked the question of Eufy, so if I do get an update, I'll post a video. But for now, obviously, we have to go by what we see right now. And right now, it records at 15 FPS. For night vision, yeah, that might be fine because you're not really recording in the same way. But for daytime and for those, especially if you're using it as a security camera, then you would want higher frame rates from it. Okay, another little issue that I did have, and this didn't really affect the camera in any way. And I'm not sure whether this was because I actually connected it to the Homebase 3, but what happened was initially when I connected it to Wi-Fi, obviously I did it inside and I had perfect connection. Where I've installed it is not too far from my actual main routers, so once again I had pretty good connection. But when I connected it to the Homebase 3, I think what it did was it actually wiped the Wi-Fi information. So I think it was maybe about 3 or 4 days after installation, I actually got a message pop up saying that the Wi-Fi details had been wiped or had been corrupted or something. When I went in to just check the settings, it was exactly like that. So there was no Wi-Fi information in there. So I did put it in, and I think what that does is it works as a backup. So just in case it loses connection to the Homebase 3, it then falls back to its Wi-Fi connection, and then whenever it is able to connect to the Homebase 3 again, it will then reconnect automatically. That's my understanding of it. I'm not sure whether that is exactly how it works or not, but that's basically what it kind of suggested. Not a big deal, but that's something that I thought I'd mention anyway, because that is something that I did come across. Once again, that could also be something to do with early firmwares as well. So that's something that they could potentially just work out of the bugs with future updates. Okay, I've already mentioned regarding the privacy zones. Hopefully that's something that they do get resolved, where when you have stored locations, so you can store 4 sort of set positions for the actual camera, and I've got it where I've got it set up to monitor the front driveway and also the back sort of garden area as well, and then you can add 2 extra ones. Privacy zones don't work when you've got any of these kind of features set up, so I'd like to see that, because the calibration of the camera knows where it's pointing, so it could easily just block out a whole region and make sure that you're not actually getting recordings and false triggers from that area. Finally, one of the things that I actually found was the floodlights that this one comes with are actually reduced, so you go from 3 down to 2, and the actual rotation of these floodlights is also reduced in terms of how much they'll actually move. Because of where I've got it installed, I do find that a lot of the light ends up bouncing off the white render on the left hand side as the camera is looking at the image. So what I would have wanted is to have one pointing straight down and the other one pointing out. Unfortunately, it only gives you so much rotation when you've got the camera ceiling mounted. If you do have it wall mounted, then this wouldn't be an issue, but in my situation, and obviously that it does allow you both setups, so you can have it wall mounted or you can have it ceiling mounted, and in ceiling mounted I don't believe that the rotation of those LEDs is enough. Now I'm not sure whether they actually limited this to try and avoid the issue that we used to have with the previous gen, where you would get that bounce off and glare onto the actual camera lenses. It could well be that. It's not the end of the world, but I think in my particular setup, that is one of the reasons why it does actually cause the night vision to almost be detrimental to the image until it gets fully dark. As soon as it's anywhere from sunset till it's fully dark, you're actually better off not using the floodlights and not using any type of night vision, because that way you're actually picking up more and you're picking up a further distance from the cameras. As soon as those night vision, either the infrared or the actual lights kick in, then it almost brings that viewing distance all the way down, because the foreground is so bright as a result of it. Conclusions. So for me personally, it's been pretty good. I've had those few little niggles, and you'd expect that with any new product, especially when it's kind of in its beta stages with regards to connecting to home bases and things like that. And I do have my home base set up to make use of any beta sort of features that they might have available as well. So potentially that could actually be adding to some of those issues as well. But a lot of those I'm hoping, and I'm pretty sure, will get resolved through firmware updates. In terms of the setup, as I mentioned, it was pretty straightforward, easy install. The one caveat I would say is once you've actually installed it, there are only 2 little grub screws that actually secure the camera to the mount. Now the mount, obviously you use 4 fixings, that's nice and secure. Because you're only using those 2 small grub screws, what I did find was in the location I had it installed, you do get a lot of wind between the 2 houses. And there were instances where I could actually see that the whole camera body was shaking because of the wind, because whilst everything's secure and it's not going to go anywhere, it was flexible enough to allow movement of that. Now, the good thing is, because it's 24/7, it's not really causing false triggers or anything, because it's recording all the time anyway. And it's only going to go off motion events that it detects anyway. But that's just something that I thought I would mention, because it seems possibly that's something that they could actually create a better design for, maybe something that locks in first and then you just use the grub screws to secure it, just to lock it in place, whereas this almost makes use of those two small grub screws on either side to actually lock the whole thing into place. And whilst they want to make everything as compact as possible, and it's, like I say, it's not going to fall off, it's not going to get damaged. Potentially, if somebody did want to vandalize it, I think that's the weak point, and that's where somebody could break it off the mount quite easily. The other thing that I just wanted to mention was, obviously, as I've said quite a few times during the video, my location is what causes most of the issues with regards to the color night vision or the black and white night vision. But that is also why I wanted it in that place, that location in the first place, because to give me those extra features in that setup. If you did have this wall mounted, I think a lot of the sort of niggles that I've had wouldn't really be an issue. And what I may even do is at some point swap this with the one that I've got in my back garden, and just showcase the difference between the actual quality in terms of the lenses, and obviously it makes more use of the telephoto lens. But where it's installed, as I've mentioned, it works, no issues with it. For anybody out there that is looking for a reliable setup, and if you have, especially if you have any other Eufy cameras with the Homebase 3, then it almost makes it a no-brainer. The price at the moment will be on offer, so there's a link in the description below that will give you a discount. I believe the discount runs until the end of January, so I'm hoping I can try and get this video out as soon as possible. I did already post the link on my social media as well as on YouTube community tab, just so then anybody that was interested could actually make use of it. But with regards to the review, I just wanted those few little niggles that I had to get worked out and just make sure that everything was working the way that it was, reliably. And as I say, it's worked flawlessly for me. The one downside is obviously the fact that if you've watched my channel, I love HomeKit, and even with Homebridge, I've not managed to get this worked into HomeKit. But that's not something that obviously the manufacturer supports. It's not a claim of the manufacturer, and that's something that maybe I might be able to get working somewhere down the line. So if you're interested in that, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for any future videos. I will also have a few more Eufy product videos coming. They have already sent out to me their new dual camera doorbell. So we'll have a video coming for that. And if you have any questions on this or any of my other Eufy products, drop them in the comment section below, and I always answer all of my comments anyway. But if I need to get back in touch with Eufy, I do have a contact with them, so I can try and get those answers for you as well. If you have enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate if you give it a thumbs up. And until the next one, thanks very much for watching.